Our speaker tonight is Laura Carney. Her topic is how I finished my late dad's list of life goals and wrote a successful book. A lot of our members do write memoir, and I really like what she says about memoirs are soul satisfying for authors, but difficult to sell. And being able to share how to just make a memoir into something that can be sold to other people, I think is a very important skill. Laura comes to us with incredible background. She's been a copy editor. She has worked in all kinds of magazines and publications that I know that you will recognize. She has also appeared on a number of television shows, some of which I do watch and have seen her on. I'm really excited about her talk tonight, and so I am going to get out of the way and let Laura take over. So Laura, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours.
Well, I'm really honored to be here. I was nervous coming into this meeting, and now I'm even more nervous after hearing all of the successes that all of you writers here have. And Santa Fe is one of my favorite places on the planet. I wish I lived there. Also, just want to give a big thank you to PK Hill and Jacqueline for asking me to come and do this tonight. Because it's really fun for me to talk about my journey to becoming a writer. This was my first book. And, I think a lot of the time when people ask me about how I found an agent, how I found a publisher, and how I managed to get press the way that I did, they sort of went like almost like a map, right? Like a practical how-to of how you do this. And I read a quote today that I think really encompasses, see what I did there? Encompasses what actually happened, because what I think it's really more about is having a compass rather than having a map. So I'll explain that more as I go. But I want to start with one of my favorite quotes by Eleanor Roosevelt, which is, "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams." When you follow your curiosity, you find what was meant for you in life and in writing. And of course, I had to include one of my favorite quotes from Joseph Campbell on the first page of this slide, "Follow your bliss." That's me with the California poppies. I have a real penchant for fields of wildflowers. Okay, let's see. Can I go to the next slide? So how did this scrawled out list that my dad wrote in 1978 lead to a letter from Pope Francis, which seems relatively impossible? And I actually did that the 6th year of doing my project, but I will get into a little bit more into that later. And this is another bit of what I guess could kindly be called his chicken scratch, but is an extremely meaningful document to me. It's Pledged to Self According to the Principles of Napoleon Hill by Mick Carney, which he wrote when I think he was around 22 years old. And I'm going to read to you at the end of this presentation. This is me looking at the list on the right. One of his list items was own a black tux. So I owned it by being photographed in it. All right, next slide. Okay, so these are just some of the items that were on my dad's list. Skydive at least once. I always love that he said at least once, because that means he thought he would enjoy it so much he was going to do it many times. And plant an apple tree. That's my stepbrother and his family. And I ended up actually growing 4 of them during the pandemic. But the reason I'm sharing these here is because I think, much like writing, well, I'll put it this way. For me, writing is about losing yourself in the adventure of something bigger than you. And these were 2 list items that, for someone who was grieving her father, forced her to be alive. It forced me to let go. I actually heard the words "let go" in my head when I was in the airplane before I jumped out of it, and forced me to invest in actually bringing life into the world, meaning growing these apple trees. All right, make sure my cursor's on it. There we go. 2 of the other list items: running 10 miles straight, which I did in Los Angeles, and going to the Super Bowl. And I think that writing is a commitment to find out what story wants to be told, not necessarily the story you want to tell, but the story that wants to come through you. And doing my dad's list was always like that. I think as writers, we're almost like we're like detectives on a trail, and we don't get to decide what the twists and turns are going to be. And even if something goes wrong, we have to sort of like go with where it's taking us. So for example, when I checked off Run 10 Miles Straight for my dad, the one on the left here, this is Rodeo Drive, and I have pee coming down my legs. You can't see it very well in the picture, but I just overhydrated and I could feel it starting to happen and I couldn't stop it. And the list item said run 10 miles straight. That doesn't mean like stop running and go to a bathroom. So I realized, oh, I didn't think that through. And I had to make a decision. Am I going to stop or am I going to keep going? And I chose to keep going. The Super Bowl, I ended up going to by myself. It's very expensive to get a ticket to that. But I ended up actually feeling like I wasn't by myself because I felt like my dad was right there with me. And I had guys explaining football to me and all kinds of things. Like they just assumed that just because I was a woman doing it for my dad, I didn't know anything about it. But it was an incredible adventure. And one of the mottos I developed while doing the list was, no matter how poorly I'm running, I have to finish the distance. And I think that applies to writing too, because oftentimes when we first start writing something, it's kind of crap. It's not really what we want it to be. But if you make that commitment, okay, well, for 3 hours today, I'm going to sit down and do this. Or for me, for example, I got to start freelancing, whereas I was working full time in magazines before. And that meant I had a whole evening to do it now. And I might go into an office a couple times a week. So I would have, I don't know, maybe 2 p.m. till 5 in the morning, which is kind of unusual, but it worked for me. So I just learned to adjust to basically also what times the story wanted to be told and letting myself just get it out and letting it be bad, like pee going down my legs while running, because who cares? Lesson one. So I want to walk you through my top 6 lessons that I learned from doing my dad's bucket list and writing and publishing my book, because as I said before, I think they're very much one and the same. To give you the origins of my story and why I was doing this bucket list that I keep referring to, when I was 25 years old, I moved to New York on an internship, a magazine internship at a small art magazine after graduating with a journalism degree. And I met my husband, my now husband, the wonderful man who keeps coming in here and fixing this for me. I met him online that summer. And it was basically the most romantic summer of my life. And I was, when you're 25 years old and you're in New York and you're broke, but you have all of this hope, it's like anything can happen. And then 3 months after I moved there, my dad was killed by a distracted driver. And was a teenager who was lost, and she was making a phone call at a red light, and she went through the next light and didn't realize my dad was turning left right in front of her. So I, being the writer that I was, decided then I want to write a book about this. Like, this is a remarkable experience. I used to say that I felt like my life had become a movie, not just because of my dad dying and the closure I needed to find from that, but also I'm in New York City, and I was taking on like big risks that coming from Delaware, I had never really thought I would take on in my life. But I had no idea how to do that. And I couldn't figure out a way I could write this book without it being very sad. So essentially, I just put it aside. And from about age 25 to I guess it was 38, I didn't do it. And the other thing that happened was I couldn't write about anything else because this was the story I was supposed to tell. So whereas in college, I had been pretty inspired and prolific with all the articles I would write for the college newspaper, suddenly now I had no ideas. And I think that's the other thing that happens to us. We can get into writer's block as writers in general if there actually is a story that we know we have inside of us, but we're not letting ourselves tell it. So what essentially finally gave me permission to do that was when I got married, and my brother was also getting married that same year when I was 38. I was visiting my brother, and by then I had become a little bit of an activist with, like, I figured out that it had been the phone that had been part of it. So I was giving speeches in schools. I was running already to raise money for activism. But my brother found what looked to be our dad's bucket list. And it turned out he wrote it in 1978, which was the year I was born. And I always sort of viewed it as a wedding gift because he wasn't there to walk me down the aisle. But now here was this wonderful list of dreams that, by the way, is showing up in my life right at the same time everyone's telling me I'm supposed to be buying a house and settling down and becoming a mother and doing all these things that would be right normally for me biologically. But I couldn't wrap my head around, what is it that I want? Because I was just now starting to get published for the first time in like big places like the Washington Post. And it seemed like every time I pitched a story about this experience, about my dad dying or about the distracted driving stuff, suddenly I was getting yeses. I was inspired. So when I saw the list, it was like I was getting this reminder of, oh, this was what my dad cared about. This was who he was. Here's all the dreams he had for his life. And, we call it a bucket list, but it wasn't really. That term actually didn't exist until I think the movie came out in the 1990s. I found out recently the screenwriter actually invented bucket list, which is kind of crazy. It seems like something that should have been around forever. But my dad just wrote like a list of life goals. And I've been told it was probably partly because he had just become a father himself. So he was now thinking about his life a little bit differently. So one of the things that started happening very quickly as I started doing the bucket list, and the first one I did was the running one that I just showed you before, was I started viewing my dad differently. When I started it, I actually felt a little bit guilty and afraid because I actually viewed my dad, even though he was wonderful and I loved him and I think we were kindred spirits, I viewed him as someone who was a creative who didn't finish things. And so, of course, my first reaction when I saw the list was, oh, yeah, there's 60 items on here. He only did 5, or, oh, okay, of course he wanted to meet the president, and my mom too. Like when my mom found the list, it was when I was a baby. And like she told me this later, she found it in a dresser and she's like, you want to talk to the Pope? Like we just had a kid, we should be focusing on buying diapers and things. But that's who my dad was. He was a really big dreamer. And as I started actually moving toward his dreams, as opposed to running away from them, because what I was doing was being a copy editor at a big national magazine. So to me, I was sort of like dream adjacent. Like I was editing the work of all the other writers who were getting to be creative, but I was taking the safe route. So now I was like full force ahead, embracing the danger of what he cared about. And then because I did that, suddenly I started to have new respect for him. I started to understand that being creative is about being free and it's about surrendering to what could happen. And one of the first things I learned was how important it is every time you meet someone new to treat them like they're an expert. And that's what my father did. Everywhere we went, every restaurant, every waiter, even like a relative, a friend, someone we'd never met before, it didn't matter who it was. He treated everybody equally and he treated each person like they had something to say, even though he had the gift of gab and could just talk to you and it would feel like a monologue for like an hour. But I started doing that with the list because I started to realize, well, what if this person I'm meeting could have an idea that might help me with it later? And I think that's really important. It's really important as writers to approach things that way. I mean, I remember, like, just as an example, one night, I used to do this thing where I would take the train back from work in New York, and we sometimes worked very late, and I would have to transfer in the Newark train station. And I did it often enough where I made a mistake and got on the wrong train. That I know, go figure, it's shocking. That I started befriending a homeless man who was always at the train station. And one night I just started asking him more questions because I was thinking about this. Like I need to treat him like he can teach me something. And he started saying, oh, well, if you're interested in like what it's like to be homeless, you should go talk to this guy over here because he's been pretending to be homeless for like the past month. And he's a reporter and he's writing an article about it. And I went over to the guy and I started talking to him and he was really nice. And we exchanged numbers. He taught me a lot about the homeless that night. And he said, you have to live what you write. I thought that was fascinating. Of course, at this point, it was early, so I was still thinking like, anytime I met anyone who told me anything remotely profound, like, oh, it's my dad, like this is an angel and it's actually my dad. But I do think that that's true. I think spirit uses people in that way to help us. So things like that just started happening all the time. And I was now becoming a much more open person. And even on trains, sometimes I would challenge myself, like, don't look at your phone. Because, what if I was trying to check off own a large house and the person next to me could have been a realtor? This slide here about riding a horse fast, that's the one we did in Santa Fe. That's Ghost Ranch, where George O'Keeffe lived, who's my hero. And that was the other thing that happened. I could always feel my dad's presence in everything I did with the list, which totally is happening tonight too, because ridiculous stuff would happen. Just like the peeing down my legs, just like going to the Super Bowl alone and having men explain football to me. when I went skydiving, I threw up midair. The horses were very slow. Like the only thing that was fast about them, I always like to say, is how fast they were pooping while they were walking, which apparently is normal for horses to do. But every time I would get a really good laugh out of whatever the list item was, that was when I knew my dad was with me helping me do this, because that was who he was. He was very good at teaching you just how to be present and just enjoy the moment that you're in. And I was very not good at laughing at myself as a little girl. Lesson 2, don't compromise yourself. So I guess it was about a year before we found the bucket list, maybe 2 years. And I met this woman, and she turned out to be a psychic. And I didn't know that when I was meeting her. My friend was like, oh, she needs a copy editor. She's writing a memoir. So I was like, okay, cool. I'm starting to take on private clients. That sounds like a good idea. And as I'm talking to her on the phone and I'm telling her, hey, I just ran the New York Marathon for activism. I'm doing stuff for safe driving. And I told her a little bit about my dad. Out of nowhere, she suddenly says to me, like, oh, I have a message for you from him. Can I tell you? And of course, what are you going to say? No, like she's a psychic. And she said, okay, the message, and she's like, I have no idea what this means, but the message is don't compromise yourself. And for a long time, I really wonder, what the heck does that mean? Like, it's so cryptic. And it could be like, what is that famous quote from Janis Joplin? Like, don't compromise yourself because you're all you've got, or, something like that. And what I gradually started understanding as I started pursuing this bucket list, and also as I started becoming an author, it was going to be really important that I figured out what I stood for and what I valued in life. And just by total coincidence, around the same time period, I actually had sat down one night and I wrote a list of my values in life. This happened purely because I was copying a story for Good Housekeeping. And I know this is going to sound really vain, but the women who were in the control groups, the one who wrote the values list for 15 minutes, and then the other ones who didn't, they were the ones who lost 5 pounds. Like, that really was the reason that I decided to do this. And I was about to get married, so that was the other part of it. But I kept that values list. And I think the reason it worked when it came to that diet study was because the women were emotional eaters. So now that they had a list of the things they actually stood for or valued or believed in, they could go back and look at it, and it was filling some kind of like emotional emptiness or void that was in them. I don't know what I am. I'm definitely an emotional eater. I don't know what it was for me. Perhaps it was my anger over my dad not being at my wedding, but for whatever reason, it helped me. And that was, I don't know, 10 years ago. And I've been updating the values list ever since. So as I was starting to do the list, one of the things that started happening a lot was I had all kinds of opinions being hurled my way about it. Like, this is crazy. How are you going to do 54 items? My dad had done 5, and he had marked one as having failed at, which was paying his dad back $1,000, which made me really sad because that means his dad had passed away before he could do that. But it was happening a lot. And one of the things I realized is this happens to authors a lot too. When you have a crazy dream about that book you want to write, or an essay, or whatever the case may be, typically you're going to have plenty of people who come to you and tell you why it can't be done, or why it shouldn't be done, or why you shouldn't be doing it, or who do you think you are that you're doing this? And then, even if you find success with it, like even if it gets published, then you get more garbage. Like, who do you think you are? You must think you're so great. And I think, no offense to the men in the room, but for women, we do tend to get this a lot. It's difficult for us to stand on our own and stand in our power. So I just had to refer to that values list, and I had to keep remembering over and over again, why am I doing this? Okay, I'm doing this bucket list to honor my dad. I'm doing it because I have now met so many families who've lost someone because of distracted driving, and they need to have a voice. Anytime I was afraid of something new I was doing, I would be doing it for them. And a lot of the list items were so out there to me. I never thought I would play golf in my life. I never thought I would be walking on a beach in St. Thomas, but that's what I'm doing here in these 2 pictures. And I loved both of those experiences. All right, lesson 3 is be flexible. So I think as I was doing each of the list items, one of the things I gradually started to understand about myself, go figure with me being a magazine copy editor, I really like to know how things were going to go. I really like to control systems and make sure it was perfect and figure out the outcome and know, what the story was going to be before I started telling the story. And I was gradually realizing it wasn't going to be just funny things happening to me as I'm doing the list items. It's also going to actually be very difficult things. When I set out to go surfing in the Pacific Ocean, which was one of the list items, I had to do it twice. I trained for it while I had the flu. And then the second time, I think I wiped out 30 times. But what I started to understand doing that is the wiping out got to be fun after a while. Like at first it was really scary, but then when the worst one happened, where I mean, and I had read about this beforehand, because don't think for a second I wasn't like researching the heck out of these list items, but I had read that what it's like you're in a washing machine. And it's like you have both of your arms and both legs just pulled in all directions at once. And that's exactly what it felt like. So it's like at least I had some idea of what could happen. And now that it was happening, it was like, oh, this isn't so bad. Like this is actually kind of a trip. And with the Corvette item, my dad wanted to drive a Corvette. Now, that probably meant he wanted to own a Corvette and drive it whenever he wanted to. This was a pretty aspirational list. But I actually managed to find that Corvette about 20 minutes away from the intersection where my dad died. And I kept putting it off and I kept putting it off because I could drive the short distances, but I did develop some car phobia since my dad's death. And living in New York, I didn't have to drive very much anyway. So I sort of just kept putting off that item until finally in year 6, I did it. And I think, if I hadn't put it off that long and I hadn't done it exactly when I did, which turned out to be near the end of finishing the list, I probably wouldn't have discovered it where I did. I wouldn't have put myself in that position to face my fear of the place where my dad died. And I wouldn't have done it right at the moment where I was finally ready for it. So I think if we're able to be flexible in the methods, both in a journey like this, but also when you're writing a book, you start to find yourself, you stop caring about how the finished product is going to look. And instead you care about where you are in the moment and you're just enjoying it. And that's when the magic happens, because that's when you actually start learning how to become that author you're supposed to be. And I just don't think you can become the person until you have the experiences that make you become that person. Lesson 4. This was really life-changing when I got to meet Jimmy Carter. So I was really afraid to write this book. And the reason for that is because I just felt like, is it okay? Like, is it okay to share personal stories? Even if I'm doing it for altruistic reasons and I'm doing it to try to change how people drive, and it turned out changing how they live, is that okay? And we went to see Jimmy Carter speak. And one of the things he told us was this quote up here. He was quoting something from the Bible as part of his Sunday school lesson in Plains, Georgia. But he said, our parents can't shape our lives for us. They might try, but they don't succeed often. And he went on to say, our spouses might try, but they don't succeed. And children can't shape their parents' lives. And the lesson that day from him, and I love how you guys might appreciate, he's wearing this like bolero tie in turquoise, which he always wore. I don't know if he liked the Southwest, but I think what he was trying to say was, if you go about living your life as though it's all up to you, right? Like every decision I make, like I'm the only one deciding this. Like I have faith, I believe in God, but God's up here and I'm down here, and I'm just trying to prove myself. You're basically going to find it much more difficult to find your true path and to live in an authentic way. And what's a lot easier to do is to believe that you have a companion in a higher purpose. And I call it God. Some people say the universe. If you recognize that you're not just in this alone, and actually when you make a choice, like writing a book, like doing a new adventure that feels scary, but that your heart is telling you this is exactly what I'm supposed to do, the universe starts to cooperate. And I'm sure you've seen it in little ways when you've set out on your own projects. Like things just start falling into place that you never expected were going to happen. And I actually had an experience with the horse riding in Santa Fe that was like this. We went down there and they gave me the first horse. So I was like the leader of this trail of horses. And later when I got home, I checked my pictures from our wedding, because we also got married in Santa Fe. We had actually met that same horse on our honeymoon. That was the first time we went to Ghost Ranch. My husband took a picture of that horse coming up to me. And I just, when I saw it, I just couldn't believe it. I was like, wait a minute. It's almost like this list was calling to me before I found it. Like this was, it was to me, it was like this confirmation of this is what I was always supposed to do. And that's what I mean when I say the universe is always speaking to you, learn its code. Because I started, I mean, it got to a point for me where I started seeing hearts every single day. You know, I started seeing X's or elephants, or, you know, it was the number 88 for a long time because that's August 8th was the anniversary of my dad's death. But then that switched into the number 54, which I've since learned means embracing change. And 54 in Roman numerals is spelled out LIV. It means live. So I gradually started to believe I'm not going to fail, even if it feels like I'm failing and I'm foolish to be giving up everything in my life to do this. This is what I'm supposed to do, and the universe has my back. And when you do that, you have to start creating your own reality. So this is my cousin's recording studio. And that's where I checked off the very last list item, which was have 5 songs recorded. I actually, this was the only list item I did where I started to feel like, okay, this list is never getting done because it took 3 years to do it, not just because there was a pandemic in the middle. My cousin, if you think I talk a lot, my cousin has the Irish gift of gab even more than I do. Every time I went to his house, we would just stand in his kitchen and he would talk for literally 5 hours straight. So by the time we finally got into the studio, we only really recorded, I don't know, 2 of the vocals for the songs. And I was supposed to come back. And then suddenly, you know, he just had too much of a heavy work schedule and he couldn't finish it with me. So I was nearing now the end of the list and I had a book deal and I had an agent, and I was actually telling my cousin, like, we have to finish this because I'm finishing the manuscript. Like, I have to get this into the book. And he didn't care. He was too busy. And I realized, like, as disappointed as I was, I could figure out my own way of doing this list item. And I didn't have to ask his permission. I could just tell him what I was going to do. So what I ended up doing was I decided I'm just going to record my vocals on my own. And I did it from home. I did it from my bedroom closet. And then I just sent the vocals to him. And I did my part. It said, have 5 songs recorded. And it actually ended up being so much better that way because I was in the privacy of my own home, in my bedroom closet. And it turned out because my dad was a really gifted singer, singing the songs that he used to sing to me as a little girl was a very emotional experience for me, and exactly how the book needed to end. Spoiler alert, but also exactly the feeling I needed to have as I finished this bucket list for him. Because the way it felt to me as I sang a lullaby that he used to sing to me to put me to bed at night was like I was now putting him to bed. And I could finally find peace with you know, for many years, people had said, oh, he was taken from you. And what the list gave me was this feeling of, no, maybe that was in his blueprint. Maybe he was supposed to die that way. Maybe he was supposed to die that way because I was supposed to do this list and I was supposed to write this book and I was supposed to be someone who can teach other people how to find their authentic selves. Like maybe there actually is a plan in the things that feel like the worst possible thing that could ever happen. So, you know, that was a situation where I actually wrote down a joke for this one that in creating my own reality, I had to pretend I was a good singer, but I wasn't terrible. I was okay. And you know what? It ended up giving great fodder for what happened just like a month after this picture, which was I heard myself singing on NPR. And then later I heard myself singing on CBS Sunday Morning. There is no there's no like ego erasing experience like waking up in the morning and hearing your voice on National Public Radio and then having people from high school message you on Facebook and say they had heard you singing Rainbow Connection on the morning news. But again, my dad's sense of humor. But that leads us to the final lesson, which is trust yourself. You know, this picture up on the upper right here, that is one of the early list items I did, which was swim the width of a river, which, you know, my dad was a writer. As I said, he wrote a book of essays in the 70s. And I'm sure he wrote that just to be poetic, but I found a 500-foot river in North Carolina and it was maybe up to my thighs, but it was also like super wild. Like the rapids were really terrible. So I just kept getting knocked over the whole time. And I forced myself to crouch down because that was actually easier. Like forcing myself to try to swim it was easier than trying to walk it. And the whole time I did it, I just thought, oh my God, I look like a lunatic. Like there's people there picnicking and they must think I'm insane. I can't believe what this looks like. It was actually scary just to even like let myself be in those rapids, and again, it was another one of those experiences where I realized like, oh no, this is fun. And once you're like midway through the writing process, it's very much like that because it's like a soup, right? It's like, where am I going with this? How am I going to finish this? What is it going to look like at the end? And you really, just like swimming across that river, you have to keep going. And from doing that experience, I ended up becoming a swimmer, which I never thought would happen. I thought I was only a runner. By year 5 of the project, this is me on the upper left, I was a triathlete. That's my first triathlon. I'm looking really happy because I actually finished the swim, even though I do breaststroke. I refuse to do freestyle for some odd reason. And I really think that led to the picture on the bottom left, which is me on a solo trip to Berlin. 2 of the list items were visit Berlin and visit Vienna. And I always say, whenever anybody asks me what were your favorite list items, I always say that one because it was a trip where I learned to be okay with myself. And that's another thing as writers that I think we have a really hard time with, which is how can you sit for hours and hours and hours upon end and not go crazy, and not like want to get up or check your phone or, go do anything else but sit there and be with you. And I think it just, that's one of the things that really demonstrates we do this because we have to. I mean, yes, it's fun. Yes, there are good parts of it. Yes, we get to be in touch with our true selves, but it really is the thing that we're made to do. And I think in life, the only way you can really find true fulfillment is if you're doing what you're made to do, even if swimming is scary. All right, this is like my husband's shout out slide because boy, I don't know. I don't know if this could have happened without him. And I feel I feel a little emotional looking at this one because I was a little bit of a pain setting up this Zoom tonight, and he still was very patient with me. The upper right picture, that's Stephen and I on our wedding day in Inn of the Turquoise Bear in Santa Fe, and we're holding the wine that my dad put aside before I was born, and it said "Open on Laura's wedding day." And bottom is our trip to New Orleans, also a list item. Upper left, the trip to London, also a list item. And the bottom left is the Rose Bowl, which is also a list item. And, one of the really beautiful things about doing this right after I got married was we had been together for 13 years before we got married. And so for that whole 13 years, my husband knew me as someone who was dealing with the grief of this horrible tragedy. And he still stayed with me anyway. But he also had the experience of he only met my dad once and then he died 5 days later. So by doing these list items with me, and he was the first person who said, Laura, this is your book. As soon as we found the list, he's like, you have to write this. It was almost like we were getting to have an intro to marriage that my dad would have approved of. And that was so helpful because my husband's a creative person too. He's a book designer, he's a photographer, he's a cook, he loves films. To finally find a way to navigate life the way we were supposed to, even though technically we're now married and we're supposed to be quote unquote serious, it was basically like the best gift I could have ever received. And it helped me to feel like I can now incorporate my dad in my family because, growing up, my parents divorced, so he was a single dad. This quote on the bottom here, this is something I actually read that Yeats said when we were in Ireland after we visited London, which was really cool because, and I wrote about this in the book because my family's from Ireland. I got this notion when we were in, what's it called, Ballyhoo or something, Ballytor. I forget what the name of the castle is, but the place where W.B. Yeats used to live. I got this notion that maybe if I could get messages from my dad, I could get messages from Yeats too. Like maybe I could communicate with other dead creative people. And I just had this notion he was saying to me, keep going, like it matters what writers do too. And then I came home and I opened up a Yeats book and I found that quote, just as a soldier, let's see, it's sort of cut off on my screen, but just as a soldier protects his country, the writer must save souls. It takes more courage to examine the dark corners of our own souls than it does for a soldier to fight on the battlefield. I mean, doing this stuff is really noble work. And it's scary, especially with memoir. For me in particular, when I started out on this project, I actually would think things like, well, can I still be married after this? And what am I going to learn about myself? Because it's going to be painful, some of these memories that I'm writing about, and I'm going to change. But I say it's worth it and you should keep going, because what ends up happening is the real you that lives in here, you know, that is telling you to do this, she wants to come out. She wants to come out to the surface. And while we might think there's no support for that, we find out the opposite is true. And the people who aren't supposed to be in our lives or aren't supposed to have as much of an effect on us might fall away, but that's okay, because it's much better. I always say it's much better to experience love from people when you're being who you really are and you're not being someone who's just hiding that creative person. And that's who my dad was. I mean, here he is. And to find these things he wrote when he was, 22 years old, really, like, that was just incredible. Let's see. Maybe he doesn't want me to read his note to you. That was the last part I was going to read. Oh, it's because we reached the end of the slideshow. So earlier I was talking about his pledge to self. So this is what that paper with all the handwriting on it said. Pledge to self according to the principles of Napoleon Hill. By Mick Carney. I desire to become a very happy man by pursuing a literary career. On this day, April 28, 1971, I set my goal for achievement of my literary plans. I have faith in my ability and trust in my opportunity to improve myself. I will constantly remind myself of my goals and persistently cultivate my talents. I have a general knowledge of the American people, yet I plan to expand my education in specific fields of human experience. I feel that I have the imagination to create new ideas that no one else has ever suggested. My specific goal is happiness through interesting, informative writings, which in some small way make another human being happy or better informed. I desire to, as Mark Twain said, scribble seriously for the delight of God's creatures. I make this decision today after much uncertainty concerning my ability. I plan to remove my tendencies toward procrastination. Through determination and persistence, I will achieve my goal. Frustration and despair will discourage me no longer. In my association with others, I will enjoy life, find peace of mind, apply Christian principles, worship my Creator, and receive the enthusiasm I need for the success I plan. I will employ all aspects that the human mind can apply, including a sixth sense and a subconscious influence. God, help me to know what I am doing and do it well. And the reason I read that to you is because, unbeknownst to me, that pledge existed and was in one of his notebooks, and I didn't find it until year 2 of doing the list. But the year after he died, I wrote a very similar pledge, not knowing that he had done the same thing when I was 26. I wrote, I will be a writer and editor for a magazine like The New Yorker, but one that is accessible for young women, because I need to use my writing to inspire women who are confused about their role in the world as adults in this time and age. I will make women see all they have to offer and help them break free of societal standards. I want this more than anything, to inspire people and make them feel more connected and less alone through art, through free expression, through writing. So I guess I wasn't that different from my dad after all, because I did exactly the same thing in my mid-20s. And as I said earlier, that recording of me singing ended up on the radio. As I finished the list, I was keeping in touch with all of the people who had interviewed me when I started doing the list 6 years earlier. There was one in particular, her name was Lee Shep. She works at Inside Edition. And I had said to her, when I finish this project, you're going to be the first person I talk to. So she had me on, and it was really funny, actually, because my editor was like, wait a minute, you just turned in your manuscript. Your book's not coming out until June, or sorry, it was July at that point. It's not coming out until July. This is way too early. You shouldn't be doing press. And I said, but people care that I finish this project and they want to talk to me right now. They don't want me to wait 6 or 7 months. So she said, okay, Inside Edition, that's fine, nothing else. Don't do anything else. But then what ended up happening was I went on the show, and then that started to go everywhere. I didn't know the reach that Inside Edition had. And next thing I knew, a week later, I was hearing from the Washington Post. And the funny thing was, it was a column. I think it's called like Inspired Life, something like that. It was a column I had actually written for years earlier. But the one I had written years earlier was actually before finding the list. And it was when I was an activist and I was actually quite angry about the way my dad died. And that's really what the column was. And now that I had finished this list and I had transformed into this person who, the best way I can explain it is this. I was very focused when I started the project on this horrible thing had happened and I need to tell people about it so it doesn't happen to them. But as I started embracing my dad's dreams instead of what probably would have been his nightmare, I started to look at life totally differently. And instead of being afraid of uncertainty, I was now friends with it. So I think that's the reason that that particular article in the Washington Post ended up going viral. And I had to just basically stop listening to my editor in that moment because she was saying, don't do NPR, don't do PBS, don't do NBC Nightly News. And like that just started happening. It was crazy. It was like, a week or 2 weeks, after it was a month after I finished the list, right after I turned the manuscript, and now all this stuff is happening. And it was like a wave, and I had to figure out like how to just ride that wave. And I think, one thing that really helped me with that was basically when I finished the list and I had also just finished the manuscript, I felt at peace because I felt like I had done what I set out to do. And what I set out to do was just finish all 54 items and write about it. That was it. The reason I turned it into a book, besides my own personal desire to write a book about my dad, was the third item on his list actually said, write and have a few novels published. So because it was his dream, that sort of trumped what my dream was. And it helped me to actually develop this detachment. I could approach it like, oh, this is just like surfing. This is just like skydiving. This is just like learning golf. Like, I can't assume that I know how to do this. And I think sometimes the writers I meet get really caught up in that because it's like you look at the other writers. Well, what's that writer doing? What's that writer doing? Should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? I never fell prey to that because even before I started having all of this press happening, I didn't care. Like I didn't care what was going to happen. Like I always just said, I just need to get it published. So I think in some ways that's similar to, sometimes they say, I think it was Fitzgerald who said, when you write a book, your voice or the style in which it's written should match the content of the book. Like The Great Gatsby, the way he wrote it was very similar to the story he was actually telling. Hemingway was that way too. But I think what happened in my case was, as I started to navigate this time of putting this book into the world, finding an agent, which was like its own journey, finding press, figuring out how to convince people to read this book, I'm coming at it not as like a writer who really wants to get noticed, but rather someone with one singular goal, which was put this under as many eyeballs as possible. That was all I wanted to do because I just wanted to spread this message of, enriching your own life, finding your own path, and not, really helping potentially to save lives because of the distracted driving. And because that I had a very simple goal, I think that's the reason that everything played out the way it did. And essentially all I really did was I had this early momentum with the viral articles happening. And then I just figured out, okay, how do I make the most of that momentum? And I had also developed a really long list. Like, a lot of times today, when you try to find an agent, they'll say something, and I've experienced this through some of my friends, they'll say something to you like, oh, I'm sorry, you just don't have enough social media. You don't have enough followers, you're not enough of an influencer, which kind of drives me crazy because it's like, we're writers. Like, since when are we out there socializing and showing people how to live? It's like the opposite of the job description. We're supposed to be like observing and inside. But one thing that helped me a lot, like, sort of to get away from that problem was I had worked in media. So I could basically benefit from those friendships that I had developed over the years. And that's exactly what happened. These articles went viral. I started writing to my friends. They're now very excited because the articles are going viral. And I started really enjoying pitching to people because I could say, hey, here's a link to this, here's a link to that. And I actually started to feel like my dad was helping me with this too. Like some of the stuff, like the CBS Sunday Morning, like it didn't, at the time I was like, this doesn't make sense. I've never written a book before. How is this happening? And I just sort of had to accept just like I did with the bad stuff that happened doing the list, or like confusing stuff. And also like I did whenever a good thing happened while doing the list, I sort of just had to take it in and just understand this is part of the journey that I'm on. And that was helpful too, because I never made it about my ego. Like I never at once said, oh, I deserve this, you know, or my writing deserves this, or my book should have this, or I should have this many sales. You know, I have a small publisher. I think we had like a 7,000 print run, and I'm happy. I'm happy with that. I'm happy with how well it did right off the bat. I'm happy with the experience. And to me, really, that's what it's about. It's not about, you know, the outcome of something, but it's rather what kind of writer am I becoming? And what are these experiences through my life teaching me about how to continue down that path? Because as I said before, it's really not about having a map, it's about having a compass. So that's all from me.